Now, the theme to develop is that, whatever our temperaments or power in the presence of nature may be, we must render the image of what we see, forgetting everything that existed before us, which I believe must permit the artist to give his entire personality, whether great or small. Deep feeling unifies the whole being. The rush of the world at the bottom of the mind resolves itself with the same motion that the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the nose discover, each according to its own lyricism. And art, I believe, puts us in the state of grace when universal emotion reveals itself to us, religiously, yet very naturally. The universal harmony, like colour, should be found everywhere. Genius creates its own method. My own, I have no other, is hatred of the imaginative. I want to be as stupid as a cabbage. My method, my code, is realism. But realism, understand clearly, that is full of grandeur. In the painter, there are two things, the eye and the brain. Each should help the other. Both must be developed, but in the fashion of a painter. The eye by the vision of nature, the brain by the logic of organized sensations, which provide the means of expression. The eye should concentrate, devour, the brain formulate. We identify ourselves with objects, we are carried away by them.
And try and explain, if we can, and think about those statements by him. I would want to emphasize to you that if you want to know about an artist, find out if he's actually said or written anything himself first. When you've got hold of all of that, then you can start seeing what critics or historians might have to say. But I would do it in that order and keep on coming back to what the chap said. It's particularly true in the case of Cezanne, because you'll find a lot of disagreement between what he said and what chap said he was up to. Let's have the next 2 slides, please, Trevor. Now, what I think we've got there is a painting by Pissarro of about 1865 and a painting by Monet of about 1867 on the right. Monet was 1 year younger than Cezanne. Cezanne was born in 1839, and Pissarro was 9 years older than Cezanne. Now, these are, so to speak, relatively early works, pre what's sort of reckoned to be. All these art historical terms are very vague, of course. Impressionism, when did it start? But the general idea, I suppose, is that about 1870, after the Franco-Prussian War. Though, of course, they'd all done a lot of painting before then. Now, if we can now have the next slide on the left, which is a Cezanne landscape of about 2 years later, I think it'll strike you as being really quite different. In sort of layman's language, it's much cruder, isn't it? The Pissarro and the Monet, certainly to us now, seem, and indeed are, amazingly sort of brilliant. The Cezanne, if we can do what we have to try to do, which is so very difficult, which is forget his paintings, in a sense, not judge his paintings in the context of his paintings, because he hadn't painted them until he painted them. So if you want to look at and think about that Cezanne and how it came about, you've got to forget virtually all of Cezanne's paintings because he hadn't painted them yet, and try and think about it in the context of the other paintings going on around. Well, 2 of his chums, equally in their way, sort of avant-garde fellows, painting pictures which not many people had much time for, were Pissarro and Monet. And their paintings seem so sort of brilliant compared with that Cezanne. Let's see the next one on the right. That's, I think, called The Strangulation. At this early point in Cezanne's life, he this is a little bit earlier than the landscape, he painted quite a few of these sort of very highly charged dramatic subjects out of his imagination. we'll see the next slide on the left now. That is, it doesn't matter who it's by, I think it's somebody called Breton. It was painted in 1859, and it's a pretty good example of what was sort of accepted to be good painting. That was the kind of stuff that was shown in the salon, and you know that sort of popular artistic taste was demanding and thinking was good painting. So it's really in the context of paintings like that that you have to think about these Cezannes. You can see that even the Monet and the Pissarro look pretty raw compared with that Breton. The Cezanne must have seemed, to anybody who saw it, because I don't think many people saw these pictures at the time, I mean, like absolute sort of buffoonery, childish sort of daubing. Now, we'll see the next two slides, please. What I think a very important factor in understanding Cezanne and how he developed is that I believe he didn't have the sort of what would normally be understood as obvious kind of natural talent for painting that perhaps one was so apparent in particularly that Monet and also that Pissarro. That, I mean, Monet in particular had a sort of fantastic gift for drawing in the sense of actually just being able to see the sort of shape of appearance, seemingly without much trouble. And compared with Cezanne, Pissarro too did. I think that an enormously important factor in Cezanne all the way through his life was a terrific tension between his experience of the subject, of reality, of nature, which was always what he was on about, and he says this again and again, and of the actual three-dimensional reality of it. An enormous tension between that and what he was making, which was something he was very clear about, which was a flat pattern. And the fact that painting was to do with somehow trying to invent a flat pattern which would be able to recreate an experience of looking at reality. But I think that compared with almost any other great painter, the process of bringing this about was, as it were, not at all natural for him. It was he knew by looking, because of his love of the art of others, that it was possible to do this, and he wanted to do it. But I don't think there was anything remotely straightforward about it. And I think that the actual presence of reality was so, in a sort of way, overpowering that it was an enormous struggle to sort of invent any kind of believable pattern in the face of it every time. All of this will be developed as we proceed. I'm just trying to remind myself what we've got here. Oh, that's that wonderful black clock painting, isn't it? Now, what I hope is that most of you saw the early Cezanne exhibition at the Academy not so very long ago, and will be familiar with these paintings. These are in the late 60s. Now, it's worth pointing out that actually Cezanne first went to Paris in 1861 and met Pissarro and others at the Académie Suisse, I think it was, in as early as that, and was very taken by Cezanne, by Pissarro. So, I mean, he'd already been painting some 8 years or so. So they're not, so to speak, as early as all that, these paintings. But they're absolutely marvellous. I think what struck me most in front of these actual paintings, which, you know, I'd love for, whatever it was, 30, 40 years or something, in reproduction, but never seen. Almost above anything else was how incredibly beautiful the colour was. And it's like looking at early Matisses. With hindsight, one can actually see that the sort of, the qualities are there right from the start. The colour is astonishingly beautiful in these paintings. And Um, that is something, of course, which always suffers in reproduction more than anything else. They are, as I think Cezanne's always are, but perhaps most obviously so with these very early pictures, terrifically sort of physical things in both senses. That's to say, they're intensely about the sort of physicality of the subject, the fact that objects are things that you can touch and which have weight and which are at precise distances from one's eyes and which are arranged in space in a solid three-dimensional way. And they're also very physical in the sense of him being enormously sort of aware of the actual object he was making and the materials he was making it from. Let's have the next couple. What have we got here, Trevor? Oh, yes. Now, there's a bit of a watershed, as you probably know if you've read at all about this bit of history with the Franco-Prussian War, which was sort of 1870, and these chaps kind of dispersed because they were all eligible, as it were, for a call-up, and Pissarro and Monet skipped across to England to avoid it. Renoir and Basile signed up, did the right thing. Basile was killed, sadly. Well, obviously sadly, but I mean, he was an enormous talent who died very early in his life. Renoir survived all right. Cezanne went down and sort of hid in Lestat, near Marseille, until the war was over, and managed to avoid being sort of found out and enlisted. But then, after the war, they got together again, and then the sort of Impressionist movement started up. And that painting on the left, I suppose, is, in a sense, as sort of impressionist to Cezanne as ever you'll find. It's a really wonderful painting. And the links with Monet and Pissarro are obvious and very, very strong. And Pissarro, for a very considerable part of Cezanne's life, was a very strong influence on him. And, of course, the message that Pissarro carried from Corot, which was so important to all of these painters. But that sort of massive, solid, physical, lumpy, sort of three-dimensional thing is absolutely there and not hard to spot in that painting on the left. If you think back to the Monet that we saw, or the Pissarro, there is a sort of way in which they, again, you have to think back sort of to pre-Cezanne to understand what I'm saying here. There is a sort of way in which they look more like paintings. They're wonderful pictures, I'm not knocking them at all. But they are more sort of recognizable as what people then would have understood paintings to be than, say, that Cezanne on the left there. There is a sort of way, and I think this is actually always true with Cezanne, it's just that his own style becomes so kind of monumental and takes us over so much that it's kind of, well, he is, as it were, so recognizable that there is a danger that we don't penetrate the style to the expression. But I think it's always true that there is a sort of way in which Cezanne was he was kind of directly he didn't, I feel that he didn't approach his subject through art, but I've got to be very careful what I say here because it's so complicated, this relationship. But the art got invented by him. I mean, I think one of the things, this is, if you've heard my lecture before, you know I always sort of start off in a hopeless way like this, and after a bit it starts smoothing out and getting a bit more sequential. So you'll just have to bear me, I haven't really got into stride yet. I think I'll move on and try and let the paintings do the talking a bit more. What's that one on the right? Sorry. Yes. Oh, is that extraordinary bridge painting? Yes. Oh, no, actually, I do want to say something about that because it's, I'm not quite sure what the date of this one is. It's fairly early anyway. It's sort of about 72 or 3, isn't it, Trevor? Something like that. And I think already it's not long after the one on the left, though it's in a way sort of stylistically quite strikingly different, isn't it? And more like we think of Cezanne as being. The one on the left, if one didn't know a lot about painting, one might conceivably think was by somebody else. The one on the right, if you've sort of ever seen the pictures, I mean, if you were going to make a sort of informed guess at all, you'd be sure to get it right, sort of thing. And I think various things that become terribly important to him are already present in that picture. One of them is something which is usually rather glibly sort of dispensed with under the name of ambiguity. If you actually think about that painting and what it was he was looking at, there are things which seem to be contradictions. If you look at the bridge and wonder about it, it's slightly hard to know what the planes are doing. Now, I've looked at this painting a lot because it's in, well, I suppose, in the Musée d'Orsay now. It was in the Musée de Paume, and I've drawn it quite often. And in fact, because of the place in Thetford where I painted once, in Suffolk or Norfolk, wherever it is, I became convinced that actually, in a sense, the subject is more straightforward than one might think, but not what one is expecting. That's to say that the part of the bridge on the left is sort of built, so to speak, onto or out of the buildings on the left, and is, I think, at a very considerable angle to the bridge on the right. I mean, what one tends to do when one first looks at this painting is sort of assume that this is in the same plane as that, the bridge going straight across, and then try and find some sort of art explanation for why it looks peculiar. I don't think it's that at all. I think actually this is going in quite a lot down the side of that building. So there's a sort of walkway coming around the building, and then you go across the bridge. So I think the plane of the bridge, which is in the plane of that, is making quite a considerable angle with that. Now, I think the thing is that that's one of the reasons why he chose to paint it. The fact that it did look strange, excitingly strange. And I think this is something that historians and critics are singularly bad at understanding. And almost anybody who paints a bit seriously from direct experience will begin to understand that one of the reasons one wants to paint from one's experience is because one's experience is exciting, and exciting has got a lot to do with surprising, hasn't it? If everything is just as you expect, then you're not likely to want to paint it, really. But the more astonished you are by things, the more sort of almost every turn of the head reveals something completely unexpected, the more likely you are to be the sort of painter who wants to paint that sort of thing. And I think that again and again, things which people find very surprising and therefore try to explain in terms of art are surprising because they were surprising, and that's why the artist wanted to paint them. Now, there is another thing in this painting which is that this little tree, this little sort of sapling in the foreground, past which he's looking at the bridge, is kind of breaking the space, as it were. Well, not breaking the space, but breaking the experience of the space, at just about the point where the surprising thing happens in the bridge. Now, again, you see, I think that was almost certainly chosen very deliberately. I don't mean that Cezanne knew the sort of, you see, the trouble with talking about this, I always run into this enormous difficulty because, in a sense, I think what I'm saying is true and in a way vaguely helpful. But the danger is that you seem to be saying that the sort of chap kind of knew all this about himself and was sort of doing it all self-consciously. I mean, I think the understanding and the logic is in retrospect, on our part, of course, but also, to a very large extent, where the artist's concerned as well. I mean, I think, but I suspect, you see, that walking wherever he was doing, down a path on this side of the street, there was a point when he was looking past that little sapling at the two sort of bits of the bridge at this curious angle to one another, where the sort of strangeness of it all was most intense. And that's the point that he chose to paint from. Now, let's have the next slide on the left. I just hang on to that one for a moment. I'll have to start cracking along after a bit. That's that wonderful portrait of Choquet. Now, I think the thing is that that letter that you heard about 50 times before we started, and I don't think it'll do you any harm to have heard it so often. I can't remember it exactly, but painting what's in front of you, forgetting everything that came before you. So there's a sort of belief that, so to speak, painting is possible, but in a way, more than that, you must forget. Now, so I think that one's inclined to say that Cezanne sort of got nearer to kind of reinventing painting than anybody else, or just about anybody else. I think that's probably true. And I think one of the respects in which this is so is that he took less for granted than perhaps any other painter. And less for granted, I think, about, and these things really always go together, less for granted about what the world actually looked like. And that's, as I've just been saying, why I think he was so, or one of the reasons why he was so endlessly fascinated by this as a subject. He absolutely did not think that he knew what the world looked like. He discovered it minute by minute. It was a closed book for him until he opened his eyes. And I think that the experience that came from opening his eyes and looking and thinking and trying to draw and paint wasn't one of simply sort of reaffirming what he knew, but actually of fresh discovery, of a sort of rawness. And less for granted about how patterns could be made in order to communicate an experience of reality. And this comes back, I think, amongst other things, to his relative lack of natural talent for drawing, which in a curious way was an enormous bonus, I think. I mean, it was only a bonus because he was such a genius, but because I think that, say for Monet, it was in a sort of way, broadly speaking, obvious how you started to draw about the look of the world. I mean, getting it right wasn't easy, but the actual sort of convention, approximating pretty closely to linear perspective, was seen in a way obvious and straightforward. He had an enormous, what is normally meant by an enormous talent for drawing. Cezanne, who I think didn't, absolutely had to sort of pick his way through what he was looking at and make the pattern piece by piece each time, really with very little idea of how it was possible and how it was going to work and whether it would or not. I think you can see this right early on in these pictures, which are already looking. It's funny, you see those early pictures of his father reading the newspaper and the black clock were at one level amazingly sort of, I mean, we love this now, quite rightly, wonderful, heroic stuff, but in a sense amazingly clumsy looking compared with the sort of painting that was going on then. And yet, at another level, they were, in a sense, more confident about the things I've just been talking about than these pictures, which are taking less for granted about what things look like, I think, and how it's possible to draw and paint about them. Already fairly early on, he's beginning to absolutely sort of say, I know nothing. And in that portrait of Choquet, we can see what I think one sees again and again and again with Cezanne, that this amazingly sort of honest and relentless and unsparing search for particular truth without any sort of system to guide him, just building sensation on sensation, is pursued until something arrives in the pattern which has an equivalent simplicity and grandeur to that which he experiences of the head in front of him. Now, there's a lot of very nasty pastiche Cezanne painting about. Probably not as much now as there was when I was a student, but and I remember Tony Iton describing somebody who's been nameless as being popped through with Cezanne's disease, and it was a very good description of these horrible paintings. What this usually means is that you see sort of rather brightish colour, sort of broken up in little sort of chippy bits, looking a bit like Cezanne's sort of brush marks, with bits of sort of linear drawing knocking about the place. And what is completely missing is the simple, heroic grandeur, the sort of total harmony that Cezanne arrives at. That's not surprising because he's a genius. Let's see the next couple of pictures. This rate, we're only going to see about 15 or something instead of 40. But now, what have we got here? Is that Gardin over on the left? And that's, what's that one, Trevor? Oh, that's that still life. Yes, oh, that's wonderful. Now, that, to my eye, that would seem to be of the same sort of date as those pictures we've just seen. On the slide, it's dated much later than that, which surprises me. It doesn't terribly matter. But what I've just been saying seems to, I mean, I would apply absolutely to that still life. It's a wonderful battle. It's, again, this is a picture which you can see in Paris and which I've looked at a lot. It's fairly large. And I can't see it well enough now to take you through this, but there are some very apparent and very considerable changes that have been made to that picture. And there's a wonderful sort of, I think it's to do with the passage through the middle, isn't it? But I seem to remember, is it that a great lump has been carved off this basket? Is there evidence of that having been driven back this way or something? I know the drawing in quite a lot of places has changed really quite dramatically, and there's some extraordinary sort of sludgy, sort of violety grey kind of paint across there. Is that right? I seem to remember. Where you know that an earlier painting of that cloth, with much more attention to its pattern, has had to be sacrificed in order to drive that channel back between those massive forms. If you really look hard at these paintings, and of course perhaps the best way to do that is to try and draw them, you do begin to get a little bit to sort of share in Cezanne's experience as he made them. And that's very exciting, and to sort of feel these monumental forms having to sort of shift and push one another apart, or I mean, the sort of emotional forces, if you really get involved in looking at these pictures, are colossal. They're sort of like the great kind of, I'm not the one really understands what I'm talking about, but these sort of extraordinary gravitational forces in the heavens, which keep us going around the sun and all that sort of thing. I mean, it really, really matters to somebody like Cezanne that things should be in the right place in relation to one another. I mean, that is what he's on about. If he's not going to give that his all, there's no point in him painting. It absolutely is not about sort of knocking up something which is pleasing and recognizable, like that fearful painting we saw earlier of the Leaners or whatever the hell they were, which is all made up. And Cezanne had a hatred of that sort of painting, a really deep hatred of imitative painting. And that is a very important strand in his feeling and in what he actually did, I think. Let's have the next one on the right. Yes, now, this seems to be quite a good moment to talk about geometry a bit. One of the things that I think it's important to believe, I've touched on this already, is that, so to speak, we don't know what the world looks like. And people who are absolutely confident that they do are unlikely to be good painters, I suppose, or anyway, painters from direct experience. Most people are much more open to the idea of making discoveries, which means ending up knowing something which you didn't know before, I suppose, about almost anything rather than vision. It's so basic, I suppose, that most people need to hang on to the idea that they really do know, that they're not insecure about what the world looks like and their understanding of it. And it is perhaps given to artists to sort of dare to not know these things and therefore to make real discoveries about them. Now, one of the ways one can perhaps try to understand drawing and painting is as sort of tools, instruments designed over centuries, refined, for giving up a certain sort of information. I think I may have touched on this in a previous lecture, but I mean, much as a sort of microscope, once it had been invented, enabled one to see all sorts of things about the world which was there all the time, but chaps hadn't seen, because they didn't have the instrument for seeing them. And the same is true for telescopes and all the different kinds of astronomical, stuff that they have now for finding out about the universe. Now, in a different area of experience, I think drawing and painting can be understood as tools, techniques, ways of uncovering experience, which is not available to people in any other way. And all the time, it's to do with this sort of feedback between the thing you're actually making, the pattern, flat pattern. You don't forget that's what paintings are. And the experience which, to some extent, the making of that pattern is revealing to you, and which that pattern is the only means of preserving or recording. Now, what follows from this, I think, is that good painters are people with a very highly developed sense of pattern. You know, just as musicians and poets, people with a highly developed sense of order and sound. And I suppose geometry, or two-dimensional geometry, is just a sort of fairly convenient word for certain aspects of pattern. I mean, it's not perhaps something that one would particularly want to define very, very closely, except in a particular context. But it seems, I mean, the painting on the left, which has lots of straight lines and fairly clear shapes, relating in a fairly sort of immediately graspable sort of way, one to another. And these things setting up in the mind an idea of something else, of straight edges and planes relating to one another in space and light. It seems reasonable to talk of geometry here. Now, again, you see, I think it's a two-way thing, that if you wish to paint yourself, that's the self-portrait on the right, and and you want to try and make a pattern which will have the sort of clarity and impact and surprise of what you see when you look in the mirror, and delight, then you're very concerned, of course, about the pattern that is developing on the canvas, and that it should have these qualities. And the sort of impact of geometrical order on the eye and mind when looking at a pattern may be something that counts a lot for you. I think this is the case with most painters, more obviously so with some than others. Certainly so in Cezanne's case. Now, that sort of feeling, I think, is then going to dispose you to start to see the experience ordered in certain ways. I don't altogether like the way I'm putting that, because it sort of implies that the experience is sort of there in its richness, and you can see it all, and then you sort of play through a number of different possible ways of ordering it. Now, I think a lot of what, for lack of a better phrase, I'll call amateur painting is like that. And I've gone in for plenty of this myself. And I know that it's not real painting. When there is a subject which you think you want to paint, and to put it very crudely, you think to yourself, well, now, shall I sort of paint it in a Cezanne kind of way, or shall I do it a bit more like a sort of Monet, or a bit more like Constable? It's very hard. I mean, if that's the way you're thinking and feeling, there's not a lot you can do about it, except make a start and hope that the experience of nature and your honest response to what you're doing on the surface will take you over and drive out of your mind any thoughts of Cezanne and Monet and so forth. But getting back to this notion of, you see, what I think is that it's perhaps better to think of kind of nature as being some sort of recognizable mush, as it were. You see, I think the recognizable side of things is of relatively little importance to a painter like Cezanne. He's not very interested in whether things are recognizable or not, because that's just to do with sort of generalization. I mean, if you think about it, recognizing is to do with something being the same as something else, whereas in fact, it never is. It's always, perhaps in some subtle way, only itself and not like something else. And I think it's that which concerns artists much more. And I think that one of the things one is trying to do is arrive at an experience, so to speak, worthy of painting, something, a subject. And the business of painting is to do with discovering a subject. And so what I'm building up to talking about, you see, is this wonderful kind of fact that the head is like a sort of block, almost like a cube, with a sort of corner running down the cheek. And you see that same sort of logic running through everything. You see it perhaps first there, and then you see it in the hat, and then you see it in this wonderful great plane on the shoulder here against that. And then that lovely surprising, there's always this, one of the great joys of painting from direct experience and painting about colour as well as light, more about this later, is that you constantly get things like that. You see, the white shirt front, which is in the dark plane, but is such a strong local colour, makes such a strong contrast here, that you get that thrilling, surprising note. And things like the actual relationship of that as tone and colour to that, say, are in a kind of way, it's hard to estimate, almost looking at the Cezanne, as they are in life. Such is the realism of the painting. But, you see, at first sight, I think, if you're used to portraits by other artists, which are, in sort of layman's terms, more realistic, you may see that. I mean, you can't fail to recognize these simple divisions of the pattern. And sort of either say, gosh, that's a bit primitive, a bit childlike, and leave it at that. Or, if you're more of an aesthete than that, say, gosh, that's jolly beautiful and original and interesting, isn't it? But I think both of those things are not going nearly far enough. What you have to do is let that pattern take over you, forgetting all that came before you, and it will begin to give you an amazingly sort of real experience of looking at a person, looking at yourself, in fact. Yes, the same sort of thing applies to that over there. I mean, a great mass of buildings, a town on a hill, a wonderful subject. Those late conversations, which I'd love to be able to read to you, but it would take a long time anyway, I can't do it, show how Cezanne was, oh golly, dare I touch on this? He was tremendously concerned with the richest and fullest sort of experience of reality. I mean, he talks about smells, about sounds, about the sort of history of the earth, as it were. But always comes back to saying that however much all of this concerns him and he's moved by it, his job as a painter is simply to render all these things by arranging colours on a flat surface. And if he once allows himself to illustrate, to describe, simply make something that is kind of recognizable, then he's done for. There's a marvelous bit where he talks about, no, I can't, it'll take too long. Right, next two slides. And it's the usual dilemma. I want to say what I'm saying, but I'm fairly sure that we'll only get about halfway through by the time I've got to stop. So I don't know. I don't think I can help myself much. What's that? Oh, that's that marvellous sort of orchard painting, isn't it? And that's the wonderful looking across the Chestnut Avenue at Jardin Bouffin. Now, I don't think Cezanne he sort of thought of space in the kind of Renaissance way as a sort of a kind of empty box or arena with, so to speak, geometrical properties of perspective into which you could fit any object, whether it was mountains or apples, and which would have a sort of logic of appearance determined by the logic of space and what space occupied by objects must therefore look like. I think that rather space, which he was intensely aware of, and talks about a good deal, space and distance. I mean, there's a lot of terrible claptrap written about Cezanne, which would seem to suggest that one of his great contributions to art was the fact that he didn't bother about space anymore and made it all flat. Well, my goodness me, nobody who's not a bare-faced liar could surely write that if they'd read what Cezanne said himself. I think rather that space for him was a sort of particular attribute of each subject, a sort of something as surprising and to be discovered afresh each time as that the sun was shining, or that he was looking at oranges, not apples, or that the trees were in leaf, or that the trees were not in leaf. And so I think that for him, the business of making a painting was not simply discovering the particular relationships in space of the objects he was looking at and how to make the, as it were, correct pattern on the surface to represent those, but rather the discovery of what space was at all each time in experience and how it was possible to make a pattern which communicated it at all And I think this was a battle that had to be won every time. And I think he was very aware of all the conventions existing before him. And of course, Cezanne loved the art of the past intensely, and it was probably more important to him than perhaps to any of the other Impressionists. And later on in his life, when he was in Paris, towards the end of his life, he used to draw from painting and even more sculpture in the Louvre every afternoon. He used to paint in the mornings and draw from the masters in the afternoon. He adored the Venetians, he adored Rubens and Poussin and Chardin. Those were the painters that he loved most. Where was I? Yes, he was aware, I think, of the kind of conventions that, in a sense, he could use, which would make something intelligible, but he was determined not to do that. Just as, in a sense, I think that he had to kind of turn his back on what you might call recognizability, to coin a rather horrible word. That, so to speak, an apple had to be seen as an apple simply because he had painted that form, that coloured form that was in front of him. And that coloured form was what chaps call an apple. And so it might be named as an apple by somebody looking at the painting, but that was of no concern to him. What was concerned to him was the particular thing, never seen before by him or anybody else in that light, at that distance and so on, in that relationship to other things. That piece of unique experience, his job was to discover as much as he could about that and to represent it. And in a sort of way, I don't think he wanted to know whether it was an apple or not. That was irrelevant. And I think these, as I say, that was extended back right to the very sort of most fundamental ways in which it's possible for a pattern to represent reality. And I think this is going back to that earlier picture of the bridge, that one of the things he did when he was choosing subjects was quite like subjects which posed problems from this point of view, where there was, again, what tends to be called ambiguity. In this painting on the right, between those trees is a drive going up to the family house, which he inherited. I can't remember what, about 1880, something like that, when his father died. His father was quite a sort of rich banker. Cezanne, who had a pretty poor time until then, was sort of comfortably off after that. Now, that sort of driveway is lined by these magnificent chestnut trees. But and to the side of the house, which is after the painting on the left, is a set of farm buildings. And there's a wall going around here. Now, that field enclosed in there is actually at a lower level than this one we're standing on here. I think an awful lot of people kind of looked at paintings of this subject, getting on my sticker, I must do something about it, for very many years and still not realised that. And I mean, it's very hard to realise from this painting that there are lots of pictures looking down the avenue. And it's not that obvious even there. And I think that the thing is that, you see, I think, if you think about this, there are a lot of things that you know about the layout of the world. You look up there and you can see that there's a drop from there to there. If you think about painting it, you realise that the two planes are indistinguishable in tone and colour, although one is perhaps 4 foot below the other. That there isn't actually a sort of visual contrast at the edge, although in some way you are quite aware of where that edge is. And if you think about it, you wonder how the hell it is you do know. Now, there are sort of ways of indicating that difference in plane. And I'm not saying they're wrong at all, any more than I think Cezanne would say this, because, you know, it's for every artist to decide what he's painting about and how he's going to do it. And if you are convinced by that, moved by it, surprised and excited, and delighted, then, you know, for you it's good art. But I think that Cezanne wanted to stay absolutely as close to his experience as he possibly could the whole time. And I think these challenges were very fascinating to him. In fact, the wall actually also curves in a rather complicated sort of way. It doesn't go straight and make angles. It has some rather strange curves in it, which again, if your eye level is not strikingly above or below it, is something which is not at all obvious in the pattern, the resulting pattern. Equally, the way all those boughs of the chestnut trees move in space. One of the things Cezanne said was, the world is more depth than breadth to us mortals. That's just one of the many things I was referring to, where he made it clear how very concerned he was with space and the fact the world is three-dimensional. But the pattern has no depth. The pattern is a flat pattern. And he wished to use no trickery. He was going to express his experience of the three-dimensional world by using a flat pattern. And if you look at this painting for a long time, it does begin to take you over and set up relations in your eye, in your mind. Your eye is led from one place to another through the rhythms, these wonderful rhythms through the branches. And the more obvious rhythms begin to collect other marks and positions less obvious in the painting. And slowly all of that begins to sort of turn and form in your mind and build up something intensely three-dimensional and real and surprising. But it's a bit of a slow process. If you want a sort of rough, approximate sense of the three-dimensionality of the world, there are all sorts of painters who give you that. And a lot of them really not very good painters at all. Quite quickly by tricks of one kind or another. Again, you see, this subject here, I mean, if you're standing in an orchard like that, you're intensely aware of this great, wonderful canopy complicated canopy of foliage over your head, and the flat ground of the orchard going through bright below. Well, what a wonderful subject, you know. How can one make a flat pattern which will somehow communicate that? Built entirely out of true observation. That's not the same as copying. At first sight, it looks flat. It is flat, of course, in one sense. I mean, it's always difficult talking about this flatness business, but the canvas is always flat, and should always be easy to see it as being that. But if you are a realist, then you want that experience of something that is flat and beautiful to take you over and slowly sort of transmute into something else, an experience of reality, but a new and surprising and fresh one, somebody else's. Yeah, I'll move on. Next two slides. What have we got here? What's that? Oh yes, a couple of Lestat-Lines. Now, these are really very good, clear examples of what I'm talking about, because although we can recognize probably at once, all of us can, I'm sure, and some people would probably have real difficulty, but we all know that blue stuff at the top is C. A lot of it on the left and a little bit on the right. And so we can begin, if we want to try to invent from our own experience what it must have been like being there. But if you don't do that, if you just simply look at the painting, certainly at first, there is a sort of conflict between the recognition which says he's looking across at the sea and what the pattern is actually looking like, which is quite astonishingly sort of flat and vertical. And the idea of that sea being some enormous horizontal plane is very hard to grasp at first. On the other hand, they are very striking flat patterns, enormously powerful and memorable and surprising, like all the best art. It's like music. I mean, if you hear some, I don't know, Mozart string quartet or something that you love, I mean, you think, oh, that we're just getting up to that marvelous bit, or I mean, you know it when they're playing it, you know the whole thing. When the music stops, you probably can't do very much in terms of singing it yourself. But as it's going on, and I mean, really, when you think of the thousands of pieces of music that are written, and yet each one somehow has its own name, it's extraordinary that art can go on making things which are different from anything else ever made and memorable. Incredible inventiveness of human imagination in that sense. But now, I think I've talked about this a bit in the previous lecture, but if you, for a moment, just actually use your intelligence and understanding a bit when looking at these pictures, look at the horizon. You know what the horizon is, where the sky meets the sea. Realize what that means. What that means is that is where you are looking horizontally. When you look at that horizon, you are not looking up. Now, this is the first thing to be very clear about, because a primitive bit of you, and you probably didn't realize it was doing this, when it first looked at these paintings, was sort of imagining that your eye level was somewhere down in the middle of the picture. It isn't, of course. By definition, it's at that horizon. Now, if you gaze across at that horizon and tell yourself that you are looking horizontally, straight across,